The gun trembled in my hands. Not from fear, from rage so pure and consuming it threatened to tear me apart from the inside out, like a fire burning through silk. I'd held weapons before, countless times across the resistance network that bled through the Polish underground like veins carrying defiance against an occupation that seemed endless. But this was different. This was personal in a way that made every previous kill feel like preparation for this singular moment of reckoning. This was the man I'd loved pointing his pistol at my heart while wearing the uniform of His Majesty's intelligence services, and the contradiction of it made me want to scream until my throat bled. "Don't do this, Magdalena," James whispered, his English accent thick with something that might have been regret, though I'd learned not to trust his emotional performances. The moonlight caught the sharp edge of his jaw, the line of his cheekbone, the way his eyes reflected the sky like he was still capable of containing something pure. For a moment, just a moment, I saw the man who'd kissed me in that safe house outside Warsaw, when the world felt smaller and more intimate than the war consuming it. The man who'd promised me a future when the war ended, a future that felt like a lie now, like every word he'd ever spoken had been calibrated to manipulate me. "Liar," I breathed, my finger tight against the trigger, feeling the weight of the weapon like it was an extension of my own heartbeat. "Every word from your mouth has been a lie." I'd discovered the truth 6 hours ago, when I broke into the British Embassy, moving through corridors like a ghost, my hands steady even as my world collapsed. Documents. Photographs. Reports detailing every resistance cell I'd ever mentioned to him, every safe location I'd whispered against his chest in the darkness, every operative's name I'd trusted him with in moments when I thought I was no longer alone. 43 people dead because of what I'd told him. 43 names on paper, crossed out in brutal red ink like obituaries written before the deaths themselves, like the bureaucracy of murder. If you're watching this story unfold with us, and if it's hitting you in the heart, please hit that like button and subscribe right now. We've got more dangerous love stories like this coming your way, and you won't want to miss what happens next, or what moment of truth comes for these two broken people. If you pull that trigger, you become what you've been fighting against, James said, stepping closer, actually stepping closer, as if my gun was nothing but a plea for attention, as if the death in my eyes was a language he believed he could negotiate with. "You become a murderer." "I already am one," I replied, and I meant it with every cell in my body. How many Nazi soldiers had I taken down? How many collaborators? How many people had I killed in service of something I believed was righteous? But this was different, because his betrayal had teeth. His betrayal had consequences measured in human lives, in families destroyed, in resistance networks dismantled by the simple fact that I'd loved him too much, trusted him too completely, and failed to compartmentalize the personal from the operational. The night air cut through my thin coat, carrying the smell of snow and smoke, and something acrid that might have been fear. We stood in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Krakow, the kind of place where secrets went to die, where people like us conducted business that could never be acknowledged. Rain drummed against the metal roof, creating a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, that matched the pulse of my rage. "Why?" I asked, and the word cracked like ice under spring weight, like a foundation giving way beneath something too heavy. "Why would you do this? Why would you destroy everything I believed in? Why would you murder people I cared about?" James's hands remained visible, empty, non-threatening. That was the cruelest part. He wasn't fighting back. He was letting me hold all the power, and somehow that made it worse, because it meant he'd already accepted the consequences of what he'd done. It meant he was standing there waiting for me to become the killer that circumstance had made necessary. "Because I was ordered to," he said simply, and those 6 words carried the weight of every empire that had ever demanded loyalty over conscience. "Because my country needed intelligence, and you were the best source I could find." I was more than a source. "You were," he agreed, and those 2 words carried the weight of every kiss, every conversation, every time I'd believed I wasn't alone in this war, every moment I'd let myself be vulnerable with him. And that's what makes this so difficult. I'd been recruited by the resistance at 19, just a girl who spoke 6 languages, and whose father had been executed by the Gestapo, whose grief had been weaponized by people who saw her pain as useful. They saw my need for vengeance and transformed it into operational capability. For 3 years, I'd been their ghost, moving through occupied Poland like a specter, gathering intelligence, arranging safe passages, eliminating threats with the detachment of someone who'd already died inside. I was good at it, too good at it, and that skill had made me dangerous to myself because I'd started to believe I was nothing but the missions, that my capacity for violence was my defining characteristic. Then I met James at a diplomatic reception where I was supposed to plant documents in the office of a Nazi liaison. He was supposed to be a minor attaché, unremarkable and forgettable, the kind of man you see once and forget forever. Instead, he was intelligent, kind, and he looked at me like I was a person instead of a weapon. We'd started meeting in secret, ostensibly for intelligence gathering, but really because I was starving for human connection, for someone to see me as Magdalena instead of as the Nightingale, the operative who could infiltrate anything. I'd told him things, not operational details. I'd been careful about that, at least. But fragments. Enough pieces that if someone was listening, if someone was specifically interested in resistance networks, they could construct the whole picture from the pieces I'd given him. Enough truth that he could betray me completely, and that betrayal would ripple outward and destroy everything I'd built. "The men I killed," I said, my voice steady even as my hands shook. "The resistance fighters they tortured to death, the safe houses they burned, the families they destroyed. Their blood is on your hands." "Yes," James replied without hesitation, and his acceptance of guilt somehow felt like another betrayal. I wanted him to fight back, to give me justification for what I was about to do. I wanted him to be the villain in this story. I wanted him to be a person I could kill without destroying something inside myself. I know. I'll carry that forever. Standing there in the darkness, I realized that he was something worse than a villain. He was human, complicated, broken by the same war that had broken me, just in a different way. And that realization made the gun feel heavier than it had before. 3 months later, I existed in the spaces between survival and living, in the cracks between the person I'd been and the person the war had made me become. The safe house was in the Jewish quarter, in a basement that had once housed a printing press for illegal publications, the kind of place where resistance propaganda was born from paper and ink, and the kind of rage that needed an outlet. Now it held me, a girl who'd loved the wrong man, made the wrong choice, and lived while others died because of her mistakes. My handler, Piotr, brought me papers twice a week, food that was never quite enough, intelligence reports that detailed the ongoing damage of my betrayal, coded messages from resistance cells across Poland, trying to rebuild what had been destroyed. "You did the right thing," he said on a Tuesday morning when the rain had turned to sleet, placing a package of bread on the wooden table with the reverence of someone offering communion. "Not shooting him. That took strength. That took cowardice," I corrected, tearing into the bread with hands that hadn't stopped shaking, hands that still remembered the weight of the gun, the certainty of my own capacity for murder. "I let him live." "You let yourself live," Piotr replied. He was a man in his 50s, gray beard thick as winter frost, eyes that had seen too many wars, too many betrayals, too many impossible choices. "And that matters more than you know." But it didn't feel like living. It felt like drowning in slow motion, like being underwater and hearing the world continue above you, oblivious to the fact that you were suffocating. Every day, I reviewed the intelligence reports, cataloging the damage James's information had caused. Entire networks dismantled like houses of cards in a stiff wind. Resistance fighters arrested, tortured, executed with the knowledge that I had given the Nazis the map to find them. Children orphaned because their parents had fought against tyranny, and I had loved a man who was secretly working for the other side. The guilt was a second heartbeat, constant and inescapable, a rhythm that never stopped even when I was sleeping. I'd been trained to compartmentalize emotion, to separate the personal from the operational, to wall off the parts of myself that could feel, so that only the parts that could act remained. But loving James had shattered my ability to do that. He'd cracked something open inside me, and I couldn't seem to seal it shut again, no matter how hard I tried. Worse, I couldn't stop thinking about him, wondering where he was, if he was thinking of me, if he'd been punished by his superiors for supposedly failing to turn me into an asset for British intelligence. One night, I found a letter slipped under the basement door, my name on it in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere, even in the dark, even after death. Inside, I requested a transfer to the Italian front. I couldn't stay in Poland knowing what I'd done. I couldn't face you every day knowing I'd destroyed everything you'd built. By the time you read this, I'll be gone, probably getting myself killed by German bullets so I don't have to carry this guilt alone. I want you to know, none of it was a lie, not the important parts. I love you, and I betrayed you, and both things are devastatingly true. I love you with the kind of love that survives war and destruction, and the knowledge that I'm not worthy of it. If you survive this war, and if you're able to forgive yourself, maybe one day you'll find it in yourself to understand why I did what I was trained to do. We're all victims of this war, Magdalena. We're all trying to survive it. I'm sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. Jay. I read that letter 100 times over the next week, until the paper was soft from handling, until the words were imprinted on my memory. I memorized every word, every curve of his handwriting, every confession hidden between the lines. I memorized his apologies and his explanations and his declarations of love, which somehow felt like the cruelest thing he could have given me. Piotr found me burning it in the fireplace on a cold November morning. He's gone, I told him. He requested a transfer. I know, Piotr said quietly, with the kind of certainty that comes from having informants everywhere, from having penetrated intelligence networks across all the major powers. We have sources inside British intelligence. He's in Italy now, with the 8th Army. He's been requesting to be deployed to the front lines. He's trying to get himself killed. That realization hit harder than any bullet could have. James was punishing himself more thoroughly than I ever could have. He was seeking redemption through death, which was the coward's way out of guilt. And somehow, knowing that made me hate him less and understand him more, because I recognized the impulse. I recognized the desire to stop existing, because existence had become too weighted with guilt. People think war is about good versus evil, I said to Piotr, still staring at the ashes of James's letter, watching the embers glow like dying stars. But it's not. It's about impossible choices. It's about people we love doing terrible things because someone with authority told them to. It's about trying to survive with your humanity intact, when the world is designed to strip it away brick by brick. Yes, Piotr agreed, and there was something almost tender in his voice, the voice of a man who'd been making impossible choices for decades. That's exactly what it is. So what do? I asked. How do we live with that? How do we continue fighting, knowing that every victory comes at a cost measured in human lives? We continue fighting for something better, Piotr said. We make sure that the world that comes after this war learns from what we've endured. We transform our pain into purpose. We become living proof that resistance is possible, that humans can survive tyranny and remain human. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and I saw a man who'd been carrying the weight of impossible decisions for decades. A man who'd probably sent people to their deaths. A man who was trying to build something worth dying for, something worth living for, something that could maybe justify the cost of all this suffering. Teach me, I said. I'm ready to stop hiding. I'm ready to fight properly. Piotr smiled for the first time since I'd known him, and it was the saddest smile I'd ever seen, because it was the smile of someone who'd been waiting for me to reach this point, who'd known all along that grief needed to be transformed into action. I thought you might say that, he replied. We spent the next 6 weeks in preparation, in a state of constant training that pushed my body and mind to their limits, and then pushed further. Piotr trained me in new techniques, advanced explosives that required mathematical precision, strategic sabotage that demanded understanding not just of structures, but of the psychology of occupation, psychological warfare that exploited the fault lines in Nazi command. But more importantly, he trained me in perspective, in understanding that revenge was a poison that destroyed the person who drank it, not the person it was intended for. The Nazis are executing 50,000 people every day, Piotr said during one of our lessons, his voice carrying the weight of statistics that represented human beings, families destroyed, futures erased. 50,000. If we don't stop them, there will be no one left to have guilt or regrets about. There will be no survivors to build what comes after. We fight first. We process our emotions after we win. The mission came in December, when the snow had turned everything white and clean and deceptive. The Nazis had established a command center in a requisition palace outside Warsaw, the kind of place that belonged to royalty, but had been appropriated by occupiers who believed they had the right to everything they could take. Inside that palace was a commander named Erich Stülpnagel, a man responsible for the deaths of over 200,000 civilians, a man who'd personally signed execution orders, a man who'd watched people die and felt nothing. He was also, according to our intelligence, a man who collected art. Specifically, he collected Polish art. Pieces that had been stolen from museums and private collections. Treasures that represented the cultural heritage of a nation he was systematically destroying. My job was simple in theory, but terrifyingly complex in execution. I would be a French art dealer named Lucien Moreau, sent to evaluate Stulpnagel's collection and authenticate the stolen pieces. My cover was immaculate, my papers forged by masters of the craft, my French accent flawless after months of practice. I'd rehearsed the role until it became second nature, until I could slip into it like a second skin, until the original Magdalena disappeared completely, and only Lucien remained. The night before the mission, I stood in front of a mirror and barely recognized myself. I'd bleached my dark hair blonde, applied makeup in the style of a wealthy Parisian woman, dressed in clothes that cost more than I'd earned in a year. The girl looking back at me was a stranger, or perhaps she was the girl I would have been if the war hadn't happened, if Poland hadn't been invaded, if I'd been allowed to become an art historian instead of a killer. "You're ready," Piotr said from the doorway, his voice steady and certain. "I'm terrified," I admitted, watching Lucien in the mirror, knowing that for the next several hours, Magdalena had to cease existing. "Good," Piotr replied. "Fear keeps you sharp. Overconfidence gets you killed." The palace was exactly as beautiful and grotesque as I'd imagined. Chandeliers hung from ceilings like imprisoned stars, casting light that tried to hide the darkness underneath. Paintings worth millions lined the walls, masterpieces stolen from their rightful owners, art that had been removed from the hands of people who'd created it or inherited it as part of their cultural legacy. And everywhere, there were Nazis, their uniforms pristine, their eyes cold, their presence a reminder that beauty and evil could coexist in the same space, could share the same rooms and the same conversations. Stulpnagel was younger than I expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of classical German features that had probably made him popular at social events before the war transformed everyone into either predators or prey. He greeted me with the kind of courtesy that made my skin crawl, because I knew it was a mask covering absolute darkness, a performance designed to civilize the uncivilizable. "Madame Moreau, welcome," he said, taking my hand with fingers that had signed death warrants and felt nothing. "I understand you're the most respected art authenticator in occupied France?" "The most respected who could be spared to travel," I corrected, maintaining the character, letting Lucien speak while Magdalena watched and waited. "Though I must say, your collection is remarkable. Some of these pieces I've only read about." For 3 hours, I walked through that palace, examining paintings, commenting on their authenticity and value, all while my eyes mapped exits, identified security patterns, and calculated the location of the weapons storage based on the architectural blueprints Piotr had shown me, blueprints that had been obtained at considerable cost from a Nazi officer whose wife was part of the resistance. The explosives were sewn into the hem of my coat, small enough to avoid detection by the guards who patted me down at the entrance, but powerful enough to cause significant damage when detonated. I had a narrow window, when Stulpnagel took me to his private office to show me his most prized possessions. A Caravaggio stolen from a church in Rome, a painting that had survived centuries only to be stolen by men who believed they had the right to everything. It was during that moment, when he was distracted by describing the painting's provenance with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for lovers describing their beloved, that I moved. My hand found the knife in my sleeve, and I moved toward him with the intention of ending this man's existence, of removing from the world someone who'd caused so much suffering. But he turned, and our eyes met. And in that moment, I hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, but it was enough. He was faster than I'd anticipated, his training as an officer evident in the way he moved, in the way his instincts overrode his social manners. His hand went to his pistol with the speed of someone who'd been trained for exactly this scenario, and I realized I was about to die in this beautiful room surrounded by stolen art, surrounded by evidence of the world he'd tried to destroy. Then the window beside us shattered, and a shot rang out, and Stulpnagel fell, blood spreading across his uniform like a terrible flower, like a bloom of death finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. Behind him, in the window frame, was James. I stood frozen, unable to process what I was seeing, unable to reconcile the man I'd pointed a gun at 3 months ago with the British officer now climbing through a broken window with a rifle in his hands. and something that looked like redemption burning in his eyes. James was supposed to be in Italy. James was supposed to be deploying to the front lines. James was supposed to be anywhere but here, in this moment, in this palace, having just saved my life by shooting the one person who could have identified me and destroyed everything we'd worked for, everything we'd sacrificed. "We don't have time," he hissed, gesturing urgently from the window frame, his voice carrying an edge of panic that didn't match his calm movements. "Plant the explosives and get out. Now." "How are you?" I started to say, but there was no time for explanations. "Transferring to Italy was a cover," he said rapidly, moving toward me with an intensity that was almost frightening. "I've been working with SOE the entire time, trying to gather intelligence on Nazi operations and pass it to the resistance. I've been atonement, Magdalena. This is my atonement." My mind reeled with the implications, but my body moved. Training took over where emotion couldn't possibly function. I pulled the explosives from my coat with hands that had become automatons, planted them in the weapon storage exactly as Piotr had instructed, set the timer for 30 minutes with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this 1,000 times in her mind. The courtyard below was beginning to fill with security personnel responding to the gunshot. We made it out through the kitchens, moving through corridors with the urgency of prey fleeing a predator, across the gardens wet with December rain and cold with the promise of snow, and into the forest beyond before the explosions started. The palace erupted in flames, a controlled destruction that would set back Nazi operations by months, that would disrupt supply lines and kill or injure officers who'd planned to use that space as headquarters. Only when we were deep in the woods, breathing hard, covered in ash and adrenaline, did James finally stop running. "You were going to kill him," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, his voice carrying neither judgment nor approval. "I was going to do what was necessary," I replied, my breathing ragged, my hands still shaking with the aftermath of violence and the shock of his appearance. "Just like I was going to kill you. But you didn't." "No, I didn't." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and I saw a man transformed by months of guilt and redemptive action. His uniform was that of a British officer, but his eyes were those of someone who'd walked through hell and emerged changed. Why? Because I realized that I couldn't undo my betrayal by serving the people I'd betrayed. I could only undo it by becoming someone worthy of forgiveness, someone who fought against the very system I'd once served, someone who used his position to undermine the regime from within. That's not redemption, James. That's just penance. "I know," he said quietly, and there was something like acceptance in his voice, like he'd made peace with the fact that some debts could never be fully paid, only acknowledged and worked toward. "But it's what I have to offer." We stood in the darkness, the flames of the burning palace painting our faces in shades of orange and gold, like we were both being burned alive and transformed by fire into something new. Behind us, Nazi soldiers were responding to the explosion, trying to contain the disaster, mobilizing forces to search for the saboteurs. We had maybe 20 minutes before they found us, before the dogs picked up our scent, before the nooses tightened around our necks. "The lesson you learned from betraying me," I said slowly, each word careful and deliberate, "is that true redemption isn't about grand gestures or sacrifices. It's about the daily choice to be better, to do better, to fight for what's right, even when it's easier not to. You've been doing that. Every day, every mission, every time you chose to protect the resistance instead of reporting us to your superiors, you've been choosing to be on the right side. Maybe that's enough." James reached for my hand, and I let him take it, feeling the warmth of his skin, the reality of his existence. "I love you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I know I have no right to say that, but I need you to know. I spent every day in Italy thinking about you, wondering if I'd destroyed something beautiful in my pursuit of duty. I came back to prove to you, and to myself, that I could be better than my worst choices. Love isn't enough in war," I told him, but I didn't pull my hand away, didn't reject the connection that was forming between us, that had never truly been severed even in the months of separation and betrayal. But maybe after the war, when the world isn't burning, we could find out if it's enough for peace. A shout came from the trees, soldiers getting closer, voices calling to each other in German, the sound of boots crunching on dead leaves and twigs. "Go," I told him, squeezing his hand one more time. "The resistance has people waiting to extract me. I'll be safe. Magdalena, this is your penance, James. Now it's mine. We each have to find our own way through the darkness. Maybe our paths will cross again when the war is over. He kissed me then, not with the intensity of our first kiss in that Warsaw safe house, but with the gentleness of goodbye, with the acknowledgement that some endings were necessary even when they broke you. Then he disappeared into the forest, moving toward the extraction point his handlers had arranged, moving toward his own journey of redemption. I ran in the opposite direction, toward the safe house that waited for me, toward the next mission, toward a future I couldn't yet see but was determined to reach. The safe house was smaller this time, a farmhouse outside Krakow, where Piotr had established a new resistance cell in the aftermath of our expanded operations and the growing danger of infiltration. The walls were thin, and we could hear the wind outside trying to get in, trying to shake the structure apart. When I arrived, soaked in sweat and adrenaline and ash from the burning palace, Piotr was waiting with tea that was barely warm and medical supplies. He didn't ask questions about James. He didn't need to. The Polish underground had its own intelligence network, sophisticated and well-established, and they knew that British SOE had operatives embedded in Nazi command structures, working to undermine the occupation from within. The explosion was successful, Piotr said, carefully examining the knife wound on my arm, a souvenir from my encounter with Stulpnagel's security team, a reminder that even in victory, you carried the marks of violence. Stulpnagel's death will demoralize the occupation forces significantly. They're scrambling to replace him, and that chaos creates opportunity. He was just one man, I said, wincing as Piotr applied antiseptic, as the wound burned with the intensity of truth. There are thousands like him, hundreds of thousands. Killing one general doesn't end the war. No, Piotr agreed, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been fighting this war for years and understood its scope. But each one we remove is a victory. Each one means fewer opportunities for them to harm us. Each death is a statement that resistance is possible. Over the next 3 months, I participated in 7 more operations. Each one was carefully planned by teams of operatives who'd risked everything to gather intelligence, meticulously executed with the precision of people whose lives depended on every detail being correct, and designed to weaken Nazi control over Poland in measurable ways. I was becoming something other than human, a weapon with a conscience, a soldier who still remembered what she was fighting for, a woman who understood that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. But I also became something more dangerous, a woman who'd learned to live with moral ambiguity, who understood that the right choice and the wrong choice often wore the same face. The biggest operation came in March 1944, when the spring thaw was beginning to transform the frozen landscape into something almost alive again. The Nazis had established a research facility outside Auschwitz, where they were developing new interrogation techniques, methods that would be shared with all occupied territories, methods designed to break the human mind before breaking the body. The resistance had decided it needed to be destroyed, obliterated completely so that no trace of the research remained, so that the monsters who'd created it couldn't pass their knowledge to other monsters. The plan was intricate, requiring coordination between Polish resistance fighters, British intelligence officers, and Soviet operatives who were beginning to move westward as the tide of war shifted. We had an informant inside the facility, a Polish scientist named Dr. Nowak, who'd been forced to work on the project under threat of having his family executed. He would disable the security systems for exactly 5 minutes. In that window, I was supposed to enter, plant explosives in the central laboratory, and get out before the building became a tomb. What I didn't know was that James would be there. He appeared on my extraction route, dressed in a Nazi uniform he'd apparently stolen from a dead officer, and grabbed my arm with an intensity that communicated danger more effectively than any shouted warning. "The informant's been compromised," he whispered urgently into my ear. "It's a trap. They're expecting you." "How do you know?" I asked, trusting him instantly despite everything, despite the months of separation, despite the voice in my head screaming that this was another betrayal, another lie dressed in the clothing of protection. "Because I was in the room when they captured him," James said, his words tumbling out rapidly, his eyes scanning the perimeter for threats. "I was on a covert operation gathering intelligence on the new interrogation techniques. When they brought him in, I recognized his name from our files. I managed to slip out before they could connect me to the resistance. But I wanted to warn you. I needed to reach you before you walked into this trap." Then we're compromised too, I realized, the implications cascading through my mind like dominoes falling. The entire operation. Wait, James interrupted, his hand gripping my arm tighter. I have another plan, but you're not going to like it. His plan was simple and absolutely insane. Instead of canceling the operation, we would go in together. But instead of destroying the facility, we would steal the research. The Nazis expected the resistance to try to destroy their work. They wouldn't expect us to try to preserve it, to keep it secure, away from the hands of people who would weaponize it against humanity. That's your justice, I said, understanding his logic in that moment, understanding what he was trying to do. You take away their weapon by keeping it secure. You use your position inside their organization to make sure it never reaches the right hands. And then, after the war, it can be studied, documented, and used to prosecute the scientists involved. James agreed. No destruction, no chaos, just strategic preservation, just evidence. It went against everything I'd been trained to do, everything I believed about direct action and the necessity of eliminating threats completely. But it also made a terrible kind of sense. The research needed to exist as evidence of Nazi crimes. Destroying it would be destroying proof, would be allowing the perpetrators to claim the atrocities were exaggerated or fabricated. We went in together, moving through the corridors like we'd rehearsed it 1,000 times, like we'd been partners in this dance of deception for years instead of months. The 5-minute window passed, and then we had to improvise, had to rely on James's knowledge of Nazi security protocols and my ability to move through buildings like I was part of the shadows. James used his position as a British officer, his cover as someone coordinating scientific intelligence for the Allies, to access the secure storage. I provided cover, my eyes sharp for any sign of a trap, my hands ready to kill if necessary. We got the files, we got the research. We got out before the Nazis realized what had happened, before the trap snapped shut on empty air. The files changed everything. When we delivered the research to Pyotr, his hands actually shook as he reviewed the documents, as he absorbed the scope of what the Nazis had been planning. The techniques outlined were beyond inhumane. Psychological torture designed to break a person's mind before breaking their body. Methods based on the premise that consciousness itself could be weaponized and destroyed, that the human mind could be accessed and manipulated the way you might manipulate a machine. This is evidence, Pyotr said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was holding, with the knowledge that this documentation could change history, or it could be meaningless if we didn't survive long enough to share it. After the war, this will help us bring these monsters to justice. But there was a cost. Always, there was a cost. The Nazis, discovering that their research had been stolen from a supposedly secure facility, launched a massive crackdown. They arrested over 300 people suspected of resistance activity. They executed 50 civilians in retaliation for the theft, people who'd done nothing wrong except exist in a place that the Nazis had decided needed to be punished. The blood was on my hands, on James's hands, on all of our hands for the choice we'd made to preserve rather than destroy. James and I sat in another safe house, another basement, and we didn't speak for hours. The silence between us was so complete it felt like a third presence, like it had weight and substance. Finally, he said, "I should have destroyed it. We made the right choice," I told him, though my heart was bleeding, though I could hear the screams of the executed civilians echoing in my mind, though I could see their faces, even though I'd never met them. We made the choice that honors the people who will come after the war, the people who will need evidence to prosecute these crimes. Did we? 300 people arrested because we wanted to play detective with stolen secrets. 50 innocent people executed to punish us for taking files that might never even be used. James was pacing like a caged animal, like his skin had become too small to contain whatever was happening inside him. And we'll never know if those files made any difference. We'll never know if the war would have ended differently if we'd destroyed the research and demoralized the scientists. Then what do you want to do? I asked. Surrender? Stop fighting? I don't know anymore, James admitted, his voice breaking slightly. I thought becoming an agent, working for the Allies, helping the resistance, I thought that would make me feel like a good person again. But I don't think I'll ever feel like a good person again. Good people don't make the choices we make. I stood and walked to him, taking his face in my hands, forcing him to look at me. The lesson you need to understand, I said slowly, each word a brick in the structure of what I was trying to build, is that goodness isn't about being perfect or never causing harm. Goodness is about trying anyway. It's about acknowledging the cost of your choices and still choosing to fight for what's right. You're a good person, James, precisely because you're tormented by the consequences of your actions. The moment you stop being tormented, that's when you become the thing we're fighting against. He kissed me then, and it was a kiss that tasted like desperation and grief and a terrible kind of love that could only exist in wartime, in the spaces between survival and destruction. I don't want to lose you again, he whispered against my mouth. Then don't, I replied. Stay, fight alongside me, until the war is over or until we're both dead, but don't leave me again. The next 6 months transformed everything in ways I couldn't have predicted, in ways that changed not just who we were individually, but who we became together. James and I became inseparable, functioning as a unit that was greater than the sum of its parts. He used his position with British intelligence to funnel resources to the Polish resistance. Weapons, explosives, money, intelligence about Nazi operations. I used my skills as an operative to execute increasingly complex missions, navigating the spaces between resistance networks and Nazi security, using James's information to target operations with surgical precision. Together, we formed a unit that became legendary among the underground. The Nightingale and the Sparrow, they called us, though I never understood why James got the exotic bird, and I got the common one. Because sparrows are tougher than they look, Piotr explained once, smoking a cigarette in a barn outside Warsaw, watching the sun set like it was a luxury we weren't supposed to have. They survive conditions that would kill more delicate creatures. They're resilient. They keep flying even when everything is trying to bring them down. We worked with a network of agents that spanned from Warsaw to Krakow, to the concentration camps themselves. Some of our network were Polish resistance fighters who'd been fighting since 1939, who'd watched their country be invaded and occupied and systematized into slavery. Some were German soldiers who'd grown disgusted with the regime they served, who'd realized that following orders didn't absolve you of moral responsibility. Some were Nazi officers who understood too late what they'd been part of, who were trying to use their positions to undermine the system from within. One of those officers was a man named Klaus Bergmann, an SS captain who'd been responsible for the deaths of thousands, who'd personally supervised massacres and signed execution orders, and lived with the knowledge that he'd destroyed countless lives. He approached us with an offer: intelligence on Nazi operations, in exchange for immunity and safe passage to Switzerland after the war. We can't accept that, I said immediately when Piotr brought the proposal to me and James, my voice sharp with the certainty of someone who understood the moral dimensions of this choice. He's a murderer. Giving him immunity is a betrayal of everyone who died under his command. It's also practical, Piotr countered, his voice carrying the weight of pragmatism that war demanded. With his intelligence, we could save thousands of lives. We could warn people before raids. We could coordinate with the Allies to prevent massacres. And in doing so, we're saying his victims' lives are worth less than the future lives we might save, I replied bitterly. We're becoming exactly what we've been fighting against, using human lives as currency. James was quiet for a long time, his face moving through emotions I could see but couldn't quite name. Then he said, "What if we give him immunity for the information, but we don't let him escape to Switzerland? What if we turn him over to the Allies after the war, and let the international courts decide his fate?" "So we lie to him," I said. "Yes," James agreed. "We lie to him the way he lied to all those people he murdered. The way he lied to himself about what he was doing. Maybe that's a lesson he deserves to learn. In the end, that's what we did." Bergmann provided us with invaluable intelligence over the next 4 months, information that allowed us to coordinate with the Allies and save thousands of Polish lives. We used his knowledge to prevent massacres, to evacuate resistance fighters before Nazi raids, to protect safe houses and intelligence networks. And when the war ended, when the Russians pushed into Poland, and the Nazis finally retreated, we turned Bergmann over to the War Crimes Commission. He stood trial at Nuremberg, and they executed him in 1946 for crimes against humanity. The lesson was clear. There are no shortcuts to justice, no bargains that don't require payment, no redemption that doesn't cost something. January 1945 came with snow and the knowledge that the war was entering its final chapter, that the ending I'd been working toward for 6 years was finally close enough to see. The Russians were advancing from the east, the Americans and British from the west. The Nazis, realizing they were losing, became more desperate and more brutal. They accelerated the genocide, accelerated the executions, accelerated the destruction of evidence, trying to erase the proof of their crimes before the world could see what they'd done. Our final mission came in late January, when Piotr received intelligence that the Nazis were planning to liquidate several concentration camps before the Allies could reach them. They would execute all remaining prisoners and destroy the documentation of what had happened there, erasing the evidence so completely that future generations might question whether the atrocities had even occurred. "We can't stop them militarily," Piotr said in the safe house, his voice carrying the weight of impossible choices. "We don't have the resources, but we can document everything. We can preserve evidence of what happened, so that after the war, the world cannot claim ignorance." The mission required me to infiltrate Auschwitz itself, to walk into the heart of darkness, and come out alive with proof of what had happened there. I'd spent years fighting without ever seeing the full scope of the monster we were fighting. I'd worked in shadows, taking targets, destroying infrastructure, preserving documents. But Auschwitz was different. Auschwitz was the nightmare made manifest, the place where 6 million people had been systematically murdered by people who'd convinced themselves it was necessary, that it was their duty, that it was the right thing to do. James wanted to go with me, but I refused. "This is my journey," I told him, gripping his hands because I needed the physical contact, the reassurance of his existence. "This is something I have to do alone." "You'll die," he said flatly. "Maybe. But if I do, at least I'll die knowing I tried to bear witness to what happened here, that I tried to preserve the truth." I entered Auschwitz as Obersturmführer Anna Schneider, a German officer with forged credentials and 2 objectives: access the documentation center and photograph everything before the planned liquidation, everything before the evidence disappeared. What I wasn't prepared for was the humanity I found there. The prisoners, skeletal figures with hollow eyes that had seen too much suffering, looked at me with a desperate hope that nearly broke me. Some of them knew I was there to do something, though they couldn't know what. They shared food with me that they could barely spare, warned me about guards who might ask too many questions, helped me navigate the camp's treacherous politics and the constant struggle for survival. One woman, Sarah, a Jewish prisoner from Hungary, helped me access the documentation center. She was impossibly thin, her hair shorn, her tattoo number visible on her arm like a brand, but her eyes still held intelligence, still held defiance, still held the essence of who she'd been before the war had tried to strip that away. "You're helping the resistance," Sarah said. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of someone who'd learned to read people, to understand who was genuine and who was performing. "How did you know?" I asked. "Because I've learned to recognize people who still have something to fight for," she replied. "The guards, they've given up. They know they're losing. But you're still burning inside. I can see it." I worked for 3 days, photographing every document I could access. Names, dates, detailed records of murders, evidence of medical experiments, proof of systematic genocide. My hands moved mechanically through the work, but my mind was fracturing with every photograph, with every piece of evidence that documented the industrialization of death. On the 4th day, the order came. Liquidation would begin at dawn. "You have to get out," Sarah said, pressing a package of documents into my hands. "We've collected what we could. Personal letters, diaries, testimony from people who were here. If nothing else, take this. Let the world know we existed. Let them know we were human. I won't leave you," I said. "You already have," Sarah replied gently. "The moment you decided to preserve our voices. That's how you don't leave me, by making sure I'm not forgotten." The Nazis discovered me as I was escaping. There was a chase through the camp, shots fired, and a German officer I'd never seen before stepped in front of a bullet meant for me. The officer was a man named Friedrich Weber, a man whose wife was part of the Polish resistance, who'd been working as an agent against the regime from within, who'd decided that the moment to act was now. He was shot 3 times. He died so I could escape. I made it out of Auschwitz with the photographs and the documents Sarah had given me. I made it to Piotr, who distributed the evidence to Allied handlers. By the time the Russians liberated the camp, the documentation was already in the hands of the War Crimes Commission. The war ended on May 8, 1945, and the world suddenly had space to breathe again, had permission to hope that darkness might not be eternal. I was in Warsaw when the news came, standing in a street where buildings that had been destroyed were finally being allowed to remain destroyed, rather than being constantly rebuilt by people who wouldn't surrender. The city was chaos and celebration and grief all at once, a chorus of voices that had been silent for 6 years, suddenly finding their voices again. James found me in the crowd. He was still wearing his uniform, but his eyes had changed. The weight of 4 years of double life, of betrayal and redemption and impossible choices, had settled into something like peace, something like acceptance. "It's over," he said, taking my hand. "No," I replied, looking around at the devastated city, at the survivors beginning to emerge from hiding, at the survivors who would never emerge because there was no one left to emerge for. "It's just beginning." The war had ended, but the cost would echo forever. Piotr established a memorial fund for the people we'd lost, the 43 who'd died because of James's initial betrayal, the 50 executed in retaliation for the stolen research, the millions murdered in concentration camps. Sarah miraculously had survived the liquidation of Auschwitz and eventually immigrated to America, where she spent her life speaking about what she'd witnessed. Friedrich Weber's wife became an advocate for war crimes prosecution, using her husband's sacrifice as motivation to ensure that justice reached every corner of the crimes committed. Klaus Bergmann was executed, and his execution was witnessed by thousands who'd lost families to his orders. James and I stayed together through it all. We were married in a small ceremony in Warsaw in 1946, in a church that had been rebuilt brick by brick by people determined to make beauty after witnessing such ugliness. We spent the first years after the war helping to process displaced persons, to reunite families torn apart by the machinery of war, to document the testimonies of survivors, capturing their voices so that future generations would understand what had been lost. The documents and photographs we'd preserved became crucial evidence at the Nuremberg trials. The voices of the dead were heard, even in death. Their humanity was recognized, even after their bodies had been destroyed. Sarah's testimony helped convict multiple Nazi officers. The research we'd stolen documented the crimes of scientists who'd believed they were advancing humanity. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked me once. Years later, when we were finally living a life that resembled peace, when we could have conversations that didn't circle around survival. "Regret what?" I asked. "Not shooting me, not killing Stulpnagel, not destroying the research, all the choices that led to the cost we paid." I thought about it carefully, turning the question over in my mind, examining it from every angle. I regret that the cost existed at all. I regret that we had to make impossible choices. I regret that good people died because we chose one path instead of another. I paused, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. But I don't regret choosing to fight. I don't regret choosing to survive. And I don't regret choosing you. James pulled me close, and we stood together in the quiet of an evening that had finally arrived after years of darkness. "The final lesson," I said, "the one that took me all these years to truly understand. Courage isn't about making perfect choices. Courage is about making the best choice you can with the information you have, accepting the consequences, and then choosing to do better next time. It's about understanding that redemption isn't a destination. It's a journey of trying, failing, trying again. It's about finding someone to share that journey with." The war had taught us that there are no villains and heroes, only people trying to survive, people trying to maintain their humanity in a world designed to strip it away. The British spy I'd pointed a gun at had become my husband. The mission we'd executed had preserved evidence that would change international law forever. The cost had been terrible, but the lesson had been worth learning. As the sun set over Warsaw, I thought about all the people who hadn't made it to this moment of peace. I thought about the 43 resistance fighters who died because of James's initial betrayal. I thought about Sarah and all the survivors and all the dead. I thought about Friedrich Weber, who died to save a stranger. I thought about Klaus Bergmann and Stulpnagel and all the others who'd believed they could escape the consequences of their actions. And I understood, finally, that bearing witness was a form of love. That remembering was a form of resistance. That choosing to fight, again and again, even when the cost was unbearable, that was the most human thing any of us could do. The story of the British spy and the girl with the gun didn't end with a shot fired. It ended with two people, broken and rebuilt, choosing to make meaning out of their survival. choosing to honor the dead by building something better, choosing to love despite everything that war had tried to steal from them. If this story moved you, if you found yourself transported into the darkness and the redemption, I'd really love to hear what you thought. Drop a comment below. What moment hit you the hardest? What would you have chosen differently? What did this story teach you about love and loyalty and the cost of war? Subscribe for more stories about resilience, redemption, and the complicated love that survives the darkest times. Thank you for being here with me through this journey, for bearing witness to these characters' struggles, for remembering that even in the darkest times, love and resistance are possible.